Welcome to the Holy Post. In a video clip from a sermon, influential megachurch pastor Andy Stanley said gay men and women who remain in the church, quote, have more faith than a lot of you, end quote. The backlash has been swift, but are people completely misunderstanding his point? And why do some Christians think shifting views on sexuality and gender are the greatest threat to the church, while others believe it's Christian nationalism and politics? Who's right, and what does our view say about us? And a new article explains the rise of spirit warriors, the independent Christian prophets on YouTube mixing politics and spiritual warfare. Where did they come from, and how much influence do they really have? All of that, plus we discover Caitlin Chess does not know what a DeLorean is. A few reminders before we jump into the episode. We're continuing our experiment this week with splitting the episode into two parts. So today you're getting the news segment, and later this week we'll have our interview. Also, for our Patreon supporters, there's a brand new episode of Getting Schooled by Caitlin Chess out this week, which is all about the very interesting biblical understanding of family and how it does not often fit with our popular American view, including the view within the American church. So be sure to get that bonus content by going to holypost.com and clicking the Support Us button. Of course, there's a bunch of other bonus material there, as well as the Holy Post Book Club, live streams, and exclusive merchandise. All right, here is episode 548.
Hey there, welcome back to the Holy Post podcast. I almost said, do you know what I almost said, Sky? I've never done this before. I went blank and almost said, I'm Christian Taylor. Because I think I'm so used to saying I'm here with Christian Taylor. I almost introduced myself as Christian Taylor.
That's weird.
That's very weird.
That's really weird because I'm not only am I not Christian Taylor, I'm not even here with Christian Taylor. I'm here with Sky Jitani.
Hi.
But you don't know who I am because I didn't say my name.
No,
it's me, Phil,
worried.
Sky.
Phil. Here with someone who's losing his marbles.
It's me, Phil. It's just me. Phil. And Caitlin Chess. Hi, Caitlin Chess.
Hi, Phil.
Have you been out of the country in the last couple of weeks?
Me?
Yeah, you. Yeah, did you go anywhere? Did you do anything?
I have not left Durham for the longest time since I've moved here.
You have not left your room?
I haven't left Durham, North Carolina, for the longest amount of time since I moved here. No, I live in this room, and when you're ready to talk, it's just like I turn on and the room turns on and we go. Yeah.
Well, you went to Italy. That's since you moved there.
Yeah, I travel all the time, but this month of January was the longest stretch I have not gone anywhere since I moved here.
Oh, I understand what you're saying now.
Yeah,
I didn't understand what you were saying because I don't even know who I am today.
It's rough for
you.
you.
And now it's time for the theme song. Yes, it is. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. Sky and Phil and the Holy Post.
And sometimes Caitlin.
Okay, we're back. Sky, how are you? How's everything?
I'm getting better slowly. You can hear my nasal congestion is not as severe.
You sound good.
That's good.
Yeah, I'm almost 100%.
You're a little less of a nasal drip, I'd say.
I am less of a nasal drip.
Yeah, you're just a slight nasal impairment, tweak, twinge. I wanted to comment. We had a conversation before we recorded on Slack whether we should talk about things like the Tyre Nichols video and the protests and the police brutality that happened in Memphis. And I don't usually talk about that stuff. So first, I just want to say, yes, we're aware of that. When things like that happen, we're always aware of it. And you know, our hearts go out to the people involved in those tragedies. And there's a whole narrative to talk about there. I tend not to talk about shootings, mass murders, tragedies like that. Like, a week ago, it was Lunar New Year shooting. And, a few months ago, it was the Club Q shooting in Colorado Springs. And a few people have criticized and said, hey, you didn't mention that. You didn't bring that up. That just happened. You should talk about it. The reason I tend not to jump in and comment on those things is kind of because of the desire that we all have to try to fit it into a narrative and say, well, this is what that means. This is what that means. And in general on the podcast, the goal is to look at broader narratives and to say, here's what we see. Here are the trends we see in our culture. Here's how to look at them Christianly. And I find quite often that when people jump in immediately after a tragedy and try to form it into a narrative, it's typically showing, kind of your assumptions, the assumptions you came into it. So, immediately after the Club Q shooting in Colorado Springs, there was the narrative that this is all about focus on the family in Colorado Springs, and because they've been so anti-LGBT, this is why it happened, and we really need to, blame them. And that was before we'd even heard, has anyone discovered a motive on the shooter? And when the Lunar New Year shooting happened, I saw someone on Twitter saying immediately, well, I can tell you one thing for sure, it was a white guy, and then no, it was an elderly Asian man. So, I'm really hesitant to say, here's what we learned. Like the Lunar New Year shooting was about Trump and his, demonization of the Asian community over COVID. Like, no, let's not go there. Let's calm down. If a undocumented immigrant commits a crime, then immediately one side is saying, well, this is proof that we need to close the border and build a wall. I was like, whoa, slow down. If there's a storm, one side says, this is proof there's climate change and we have to all stop, using real straws. And I just like, slow down. Individual incidents don't tell us a ton about overall trends. And that's why I tend not to jump in. And also there's so many, last year we averaged more than one mass shooting a day in America. So you also get to the point of, okay, if I'm starting to talk about them, which ones am I choosing to not talk about? And what does that say about the narrative that I'm bringing to this? So that's why I tend not to bring up recent news, bad news, tragedy stories. Does that make sense to you, Skye?
It does make sense to me, Phil. And I do think, though, some in our audience, when we haven't mentioned some of these events in the past, they take it as we must not care, or we're not paying attention, or we don't want to talk about those things because they're controversial. And it's none of those.
We never talk about anything controversial. That would be terrible.
But your instincts. I remember years ago, I wrote a piece and I sent it to an editor at a magazine or newspaper that I knew, and she said the problem with your piece, Skye, is it's very thoughtful, but it's like a week too late, because it was about an event that had happened. And I read, and she said, we need commentary and articles like within 24 hours of the event. And I said, I and no one else could have written this piece 24 hours after the event because it includes data and perspective that only came out much later. But her argument was basically, well, the news cycle has moved on and we're not interested in bigger, thoughtful pieces. We need immediate hot takes. They want hot takes is basically what it was. And so as much as we often on the lighter issues will give hot takes on silly stuff, on these really important, dramatic, painful stories, hot takes are often not helpful. And there may be a lot that comes out of the Tyre Nichols tragedy and issues that are worth talking about and digesting, and we will do that at some point. But usually in the hours following something like this, the hot takes are not usually very helpful, and we don't want to just give those because people want them.
Right. And with the Tyre Nichols situation, I'm hearing people on one side say, well, this is proof that there isn't racism because it was black police officers. And I'm hearing people on the other side say, well, this is proof that even black police officers can internalize whiteness. So no matter where you are, the urge is to take an event, to take a data point and force it through the screen of your pre-existing assumptions. And I really try not to do that, which sometimes means I just hold my tongue, and which does not mean I don't care or don't know. Caitlin, you had something to say?
I also just think that's instructive for, I think one of the big things that happens after every instance like this of some tragedy, especially some great injustice, is you'll see people on Twitter say, if your pastor doesn't talk about this tomorrow or this week or whatever, then leave your church. And depending on what the event is, and depending on how close you are to the event, like if you're a church in Memphis, you will deal with this differently than a church in Colorado or California. There might be a moment where totally chucking your sermon and doing a new thing is right. But what I have tended to appreciate in pastors that I have respected is, not doing that out of a fear of what Phil just said of like, oh, this is a great sermon illustration of this point I was already going to make. Like, that's not treating a human being who experienced a tragedy in an honoring way. And it really is more reflective of your opinion of things than of an analysis of what's actually happening. But what I have always appreciated, and this is what my church did this last week, was the prayer that we give every week for a variety of concerns in the congregation included just mourning of this injustice. And I think it meant a lot to the people in that church who worry that we're handling racial justice well, who are concerned that we think about it, in good ways and that we care about it in our community. It mattered to them that we didn't just give a vague general prayer against injustice, but that because this event was weighing on people in the church, the prayer was for this person and their family and for the issue of police brutality more broadly. It didn't have to be an example of the biblical text. It didn't have to be a sermon about injustice, but it recognized that something important has to be done to acknowledge those things and a church that is not us, to corporately mourn them, but that it didn't have to be roped into a larger narrative.
I agree with that. If we had a weekly prayer, I would definitely include those things in a weekly prayer. Maybe that's what our newsletter will be about. We might start a newsletter. I don't know if you've noticed this, but if you go to holypost.com, you can sign up for our newsletter. And you've been able to sign up for our newsletter for 3 years now, and we have never had a newsletter. And we don't have a newsletter.
It's like signing up to put your money down on that Tesla pickup truck.
Yeah, you're pre-ordering our newsletter, which
it's a high bar you just set, Sky.
May or may never. No, the Tesla pickup truck is not a high bar. It's a ridiculous vehicle.
Okay, I'll admit that, Sky, when you started saying words about a car, my brain just heard car and didn't listen to anything else.
No, I just have to get this off my chest about the Tesla pickup truck. Folks at home, if you showed a 5-year-old a picture of a DeLorean and then asked them to draw that picture from memory, that's the Tesla pickup truck. Okay, I'm just going to leave you with that. If you don't believe me, clearly Caitlin, from the look on her face, does not believe me.
I just don't know what that means.
Well, you will when you Google Tesla pickup truck. You will say,
I'm not sure she knows what... I'm not sure she knows what a DeLorean
is.
Exactly.
Oh,
nope.
No. Back to the Future. Have you ever seen the movie Back to the Future?
No. Is that the one where... I don't know. No, I'm not confident.
Oh, help me.
Yeah, this is not good.
Is it a Star Wars thing?
Oh, help me,
no.
Jesus. Be patient.
She probably thinks a DeLorean is some kind of mixed drink.
Okay.
No, I thought maybe it was a spaceship.
She went to Liberty. She doesn't know mixed drinks.
Exactly. That's my point.
Oh, that's your point. Oh, yeah. I didn't know that. I didn't know you were making fun of Caitlin. Well, I didn't think you'd do that. I'm really shocked. Aren't you shocked, Caitlin? I'm shocked. I would never do that. You don't know what a DeLorean is? Oh my goodness. Okay, I'm going to move right along. Needless to say, I'm not a big fan of the Elon Musk Tesla pickup truck. I think it's ridiculous. Andy Stanley's in the news. Who's Andy Stanley? That would be a great cartoon pastor. Hi there, kids. I'm Andy Stanley. Andy Stanley is the son of Charles Stanley. Charles Stanley was a super popular, super famous preacher. I've heard people in the Southern Baptist Convention calling preachers pulpiteers. Have you heard that term before?
Only negatively.
No, but I kind of like it.
The guy who just came back, it's like someone who knows how to fly a pulpit, or design a really wild one for Disney World. The guy who had to step out of the pulpit, because of an accusation of abuse, and then his friends put him back in 4 months later and said he was all better. One of the people introducing him said that he's one of America's greatest pulpiteers. I thought, what the heck is that?
I actually appreciate the fact that it's more specific than calling that person a pastor, because a pastor is actually shepherding the lives of their flock, whereas a pulpiteer is somebody who just performs in a pulpit.
Shepherding their pulpit.
Right.
It reminds me of the Rocketeer, like a really cool Art Deco helmet when he gets on his pulpiteer.
Or the Musketeers.
The Three Pulpiteers. Let's do a movie, The Three Pulpiteers. Okay, we're talking about Andy Stanley, though. Andy Stanley. Andy Stanley pastor of North Point Church, which is one of America's major churches, multi-site, huge church in Atlanta, very influential pastor. He's under attack from the right. Is anyone ever in Christianity under attack from the left? I don't know if the left notices people like Andy Stanley very much. But anyway, he's under attack from the right for comments he made about gay Christians. And he said in a clip that was released on Twitter and has been viewed over 1.2 million times as of last Thursday, he said, a gay person who still wants to attend church after the way they've been treated, I'm telling you, they have more faith than I do. They have, and then he looked out at his audience, said, they have more faith than a lot of you. He talked about how hard it is to be accepted into church if you're same-sex attracted. He said, we have something to learn from a group of men and women who love Jesus that much and who want to worship with us. So he was really hitting just how hard it can be for people that are same-sex attracted to come to a church. And that to him, that was a sign of greater faith maybe than he had. And people went a little crazy for that because they believed he was changing the theology there. And I don't know that he was or wasn't. It was a little fuzzy.
Well, Caitlin, you asked earlier when we were slacking about this, whether there's a larger clip or a what's the context of his statement? And I haven't been able to find it. So it's hard to know from that brief segment what the bigger
I don't know if it was an aside. Since then, people have come up with, other quotes that he said that they were, they thought were a little questionable. Like in one sermon series, he said that we need to unhitch our theology from the Old Testament, and that's what first century church leaders did. They unhitched the church from the worldview of the Old Testament and all the regulations of Jewish scriptures. He said, Peter, James, and Paul elected to unhitch the Christian faith from their Jewish scriptures, and my friends, we must as well.
That is a really gross oversimplification of the teaching of the apostles.
It's also
for sure.
Not even just an oversimplification. Like, it was central prior to the existence of the New Testament that people understand themselves continually, even if they were changing their identity in terms of their Jewishness, or more Gentiles are joining the church and they're re-understanding where the bounds of their community is. The scripture that's talked about in the New Testament, when it talks about the power of scripture, is the Old Testament that they received as a gift and still used as instructive for their life and helped them understand who Jesus was and what he had did and what had happened. The idea that, yes, there's a renegotiation of terms, but there's no discarding of that. That's not even an oversimplification. Right. That's just the opposite of what happened.
Yeah. Well said. Going back to his original comment, though, that for a gay person to continue to participate in the life of the church takes enormous faith or courage. I mean, taking a step back from the very culturally sensitive issue of sexual identity, you can apply that same statement to anybody who's a part of a church congregation who finds themselves a minority in the midst of a majority. So I've known people who have spent decades in predominantly white churches who are African American, and it's hard, where you're not going to be completely understood, where your experience is not shared, where your perspective is often seen as foreign or illegitimate. That's true of a lot of single people in churches that only value and validate people who are married. It's true of older people in younger congregations, young people in older congregations. There's a lot of different places where it's difficult to be in fellowship and communion because you're on the periphery. That takes courage, no matter who it is. And so I don't disagree with his statement that somebody who is gay and finds themselves in a church that is not theologically affirming of that, that's hard. That's going to be difficult. And that's just a fact. I'm not sure that means he's making any grand sweeping theological statement
I don't know.
Human sexuality.
And I reached out, the guy who found that clip and posted it is a friend of mine who started out attacking me on Twitter. He's a very conservative Southern Baptist pastor in Florida, and he started out attacking me on Twitter and then said, but he loved What's in the Bible and VeggieTales, and so we started talking, and now we're kind of friends, and we kind of poke at each other in Twitter direct messages every now and then. So he posted this.
It sounds like a very deep friendship, Phil.
It's a very deep friendship.
But that's still nice. That's a nice story.
Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, Caitlin. Sky, cynical Death Star man, Caitlin, warm, compassionate book person. That's what I can tell from the pictures that I see. Okay. Phil, hexagonal humorist. So I reached out to him and said, I didn't hear anywhere in that clip where he said he thought it was okay to be an active homosexual couple. I didn't hear anywhere in that, did you hear that? And he said, well, he didn't say it wasn't. And that was the response. So there's a lot of testimony from silence going on.
So
where,
okay, basically what I'm getting is people are upset with Andy Stanley because he used the example of gay people positively, or he affirmed something admirable about people who are gay or lesbian. Is that what people are upset about?
Well, he didn't remind everyone that he believes it's a sin.
Although we don't know what the rest of the context of that
that's what kills me. We have no idea if this is in service of another point, if this is connected to other sexuality things.
Yeah. My friend is the one who cut that clip out of the larger clip, which is why I reached out to him and said, could I see the whole clip? And he hasn't gotten back to me yet. But I asked him, did he appear to change his theological position at any point? And he said, well, he didn't affirm the negative.
That's like saying, if I point out that the Nazis had really cool uniforms, that's not me affirming Nazis. I
certainly hope you're smart enough not to point out that the Nazis had really cool uniforms.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, I'm just saying like as a point of style.
And that's the problem. That is the problem because what? Because let's say the LGBTQ community, remember that Star Wars robot, LGB2? LGBTQ community is viewed in some corners of Christianity like they're the Nazis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but even the Nazis had great uniforms. Exactly. But that's not saying anything about affirming their ideology or passing judgment on the evil or excusing the evil that they did. That's like it's a non. I don't know. Maybe I'm digging myself into too big a hole here, but simply saying something positive about an individual or group of people with whom you may have theological disagreements with is not in any way giving license to something that you theologically disagree with.
Yeah, I agree.
So I don't know. I think people are making a big deal out of little information here.
Kaylee.
Well, I think the other thing is one of the things, and again, I wish I knew what point he was making that was larger than this, but I do think there's something really important that he is saying that we should be able to hear, even if we are worried about his theology or we have concerns with where he's going with this, which is to say that it has always been true that people who are marginalized within the people of God have a unique perspective on us that needs to be listened to and heard. And that's been true even in places of theological dispute. Like there's a reason why, for example, in my theological education, we go back and learn about groups of people, about theologians who the church decided were so wrong as to designate their theology a heresy. But we read them and learn from them because they saw things in the church that people who were within that circle didn't always see. That difference between what they believed and what other Christians believed highlights a tension in the faith that we're trying to preserve and things that are important to us. Yep. And it's always been true, whether we are, as Skye well described, whether we're talking about gay people who have, in spite of the opposition they faced and a lot of the cruelty they have faced, have found themselves committed to the gospel of Christ and want to belong to a local community. The same is true of all these other people Skye listed. Those should be resources for us to say, like, I don't have to agree with everything that you think or do, but you have a perspective on my community that as someone who fits very comfortably within it, I don't have. And I need you to tell me what you see, even if ultimately I don't end up thinking that all of your observations are correct or I don't change everything about how I do things. Especially for leaders in the church, like I'm glad to hear that Andy Stanley, again, this is the world we live in where then I have to say like, oh, don't agree with Andy Stanley about everything. But I really appreciate about that statement is his acknowledgement that there are people within our midst who their experiences give us a unique perspective on us as a community. And I think that's true of reading scripture. It's true of theology. Like we need people that have that kind of experience to help us understand ourselves and God well. And we'll miss out on it if we're just like, you're not in our team, you disagree with us on this thing, so you're now, exempt from influencing what we believe.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you. So here's the other point I wanted to bring up, because there is a lot of talk about the American church being in trouble. And frankly, we're part of that conversation because we kind of started this podcast to say we're worried about the direction of evangelicalism in North America. We want to talk about it. And what is evangelicalism and what does it mean? We have a lot of people that are on our show that we talk to frequently that would say, the biggest threats to the church in North America right now are quest for power that we see in Christian nationalism, compromise that we see in supporting Donald Trump, and changing our values on things like immigration or character of leaders because it needs to fit our cultural political agenda. Okay, so we've got one whole school of people that I would probably include all three of us in that say the biggest issue right now. You can disagree, Caitlin. You can disagree.
I might.
Okay. Maybe Caitlin disagrees. We'll wait to hear about that. That'll be fun. Who say this is, these are the issues the church needs to be wrestling with because this is keeping people away from Christ. But I was just reading a conservative journalist, writes for the Daily Wire, talking about the biggest threat facing the church going forward. And from that perspective, the biggest threat facing the church in America going forward is leaders compromising about sexuality and gender. Mm-hmm. End of the story. It's not one of a list of things that we should be worried about. That's the whole list. Compromise about gender and sexuality is what's going to destroy the church in North America. And I find those two perspectives so starkly different that it's, but I realize the goal is the same. It's like I'm trying to help the church. I'm trying to help the church stay healthy. That's why I have to call out Andy Stanley, because I think he's compromising on gender or sexuality. That's why I have to call out anyone on Twitter who puts pronouns in their bio, because they're compromising on gender, and that's ruining the church. So how I want the wisdom of Caitlin Chess and Skye Jitani to say, what does it all mean? How can our views of what is damaging the church be so different? Who wants to go first?
Caitlin.
Skye, you were looking like you were going to talk.
I was just gonna, welcome you into the conversation.
Oh my God.
Ladies first.
Are you both opting out? Do I have to just monologue this one?
No.
Okay.
First thing I will say is I do think part of what makes this dynamic difficult in a way that it hasn't always been so difficult in the past is we have so much more ability now to hear from people who are making pronouncements on what is the biggest threat for the whole American church or the whole global church or what. And as someone who recently moved from Dallas, Texas, which has a very different set of churches and concerns and what's happening there, the churches in my neighborhood, the church I went to, vastly different from now being in Durham, North Carolina, where I don't know about the majority, but much more of the churches here are from mainline denominations and traditions, much more progressive city. The concerns are totally different. Like if I was pastoring a church in either of those places, regardless of the denomination, which is its own question of what's more important, like what is a threat, quote unquote, to us is different depending on your tradition, depending on where you live, depending on what time it is, depending on the specific political issues that are impressing upon your congregation, or this even just the personalities of the people that you are supposed to shepherd. Like, I think what makes this difficult is I think a lot of people, not everyone, some people really are just pundits that are making a lot of money freaking people out. But of the people who are being earnest in their evaluation of things, I think a lot of what happens is they are shaped by the place they are in, and then they extend that to everywhere and everything. And it will depend. Like, it will depend in your church with your people what is the biggest threat. And I don't even know that identifying that is the important question. I think it's we're always going to be making contingent time-bound decisions about what to say and when and what to be concerned about and when. And I think the more that we get caught up in big national conversations about it, the harder it is for a lot of people to see what's happening in their own place. It doesn't mean that big national stuff isn't relevant. Like, we're talking about that. I think it matters to think about what's happening more broadly and how it shapes individual churches. But I think some people spend all of their time thinking about that, and they're not thinking about what's important on Twitter is not maybe what's important in my church to address.
Sky.
Totally agree with Caitlin. I'll add this. The greatest threat to the church is whatever it is drawing our affections away from Jesus, period.
Yep.
And that's going to look different, to Caitlin's point. That will look different in different places and different communities. But more to the point of what you're addressing here, Phil, whenever we get into the posture of pronouncing what is the greatest threat to the church, it's usually something that the person making the pronouncement doesn't personally struggle with whatsoever. And in that way, our goal is not really, I need to say these things to protect the church. It's, I need to say these things in order to elevate my own perception of self-righteousness. And that feeds right into what Jesus talked about in the Sermon on the Mount, where he warned us against calling out the speck in our brother's eye rather than the log in our own. So when somebody gets up there and says, well, transgenderism and sexuality, all these things, that's the greatest threat to the church, what you're not saying is, and I am not in that category, so therefore I am not the greatest threat to the church, therefore I am what's right with the church.
Yeah.
Or on the flip side.
That's what I'm saying, Sky.
Right.
I am not a Christian nationalist, so I am not a threat to the church. I'm on the good guy team.
Well, and that's exactly, and where you or I or Caitlin may get into that stance of, well, those Christians are the real threat to the church. It's also a way for us of declaring we're not, we're okay. And that's where we have to be really, really careful. And we need to slow down and go, wait a minute, where's the log in my own eye? How am I tempted in the same way that a Christian nationalist might be, is a way of what fear am I trying to mitigate through my own self-righteousness that a Christian nationalist is trying to mitigate through their Christian nationalism. And anyway, this whole pronouncement of what's the greatest threat, I think is just, it's kind of weird, because going back to the Old Testament again, like the greatest threat to ancient Israel was never an outside force. It was always the internal estrangement from devotion to Yahweh and their commitment to idols and their fear. And
so
that's
it's
true of
Christian
the church.
nationalism.
It can be, yes. It could also be other things. So that's where we have to be self-reflective.
Yeah, and I think to Sky's point, it's interesting that it seems like the two camps that you have identified, Phil, and I do think that describes a lot of the posturing that happens online and in person. Those are like the two things that are typically problems for the people of God: sex and power. Like, it's not, we have identified that those are both, dangerous things in the sense that, one of those can corrupt you as you exercise it. The other is this site of vulnerability where a lot of abuse and exploitation happens, and a lot of just confusion about what is healthiest for human. Those are two intimate, important, powerful things that, of course, it makes sense that we would identify them. The problem is that we tend to think we've identified the number one thing, and so I can justify not caring or even perpetuating any of the other threats, so-called, that are under it, because once I've identified the most important one, then I just have to attack that, and I don't have to worry. I just have to care about what I see as sexual immorality. I don't have to care about power, or I just have to think about power. Sexual morality doesn't matter at all. And you can really justify a lot of messed up stuff if you've decided all I have to do is identify the most important problem and put all of my resources behind that.
But Caitlin, I wanted to have it all cleaned up in a nice little box with a bow on top. So I know who's messing up the church, and I know that it's not me. Why can't I have that, Caitlin?
Sorry. It might be you. I don't know.
Well, remember that famous G.K. Chesterton quote?
Yes, that's what I was thinking of. It is you.
Know,
it's me.
The problem, sir, is me. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. They said, what is the biggest problem facing the world today? And he said, the problem, sir, is me.
Although
It might be apocryphal. We're not sure if he actually said
Yeah, that's true.
It's still good. It's still good.
I know, it's still good, and we still love it. Okay, we need to take a break, and we are going to come back and talk about the Rise, the most exciting new rising group in the Christian American scene. We're going to talk about right after this break, so hang on. The Holy Post podcast is supported by listeners like you. This episode is also sponsored by Faithful Counseling. This is Phil. I don't always feel like the best version of myself. Relationship conflicts, parenting challenges, work stress. I can try talking it out with my dog, but I found it much more productive sometimes to sit down with a trained professional. And finding a professional therapist that shares my faith convictions is even better. If you're feeling overwhelmed with life and your dog just doesn't have great advice, try Faithful Counseling. Schedule weekly video or phone sessions with a Christian therapist. It's easy and free to change therapists to find the right fit for you, and financial aid is available. We all need someone to talk to sometimes, and Faithful Counseling can help. Continue growing into the best version of yourself. Visit faithfulcounseling.com/holypost and get the professional, faith-based counseling that you need. They've even got a special offer for our listeners. Right now, you can get 10% off your first month at faithfulcounseling.com/holypost. Thanks again to Faithful Counseling for sponsoring this episode. And now, back to the show. Welcome back to the show. So, you're excited to hear what is the newest rising group of Christians that are affecting America and the world beyond. There's an article in the New Republic called The Rise of Spirit Warriors on the Christian Right, How an Extreme Transformation in American Religion Poses an Existential Threat to Our Democracy. You gotta kind of take it with a grain of salt when anyone uses words like existential threat to our democracy.
Yeah.
Maybe a little hyperbolic.
Maybe a little hyperbolic, but you know, journalists got to sell.
Yeah.
Got to sell clicks and pages. The change in the religious landscape that generally attracts the most media attention is the rise of the nones, individuals who do not identify with any religion. But this apparent move towards secularism has occurred alongside a countervailing trend among those who do identify with religion. A hotter and more reactionary style of religion is surging in America and mainstreaming certain radical frameworks. It cuts across traditional denominations lines. It tracks some global shifts in religion, shifts in which America is a follower as well as a leader, and it represents a significant threat to the future of American democracy. What is it? What is it? Church ladies run amok, drinking at bridge parties and then trashing their local libraries, looking for drag queens? No, that's not what it is. There's a whole lot of drag queen stuff on Christian Twitter. YouTube prophets preaching spiritual warfare is the best way I can probably summarize it up. And then the article goes through just some of the political claims over the last election cycle that involve demons, God, hell, and our political enemies. Lance Wallnau, who we've talked about before numerous times on the show, is affiliated with the prophets and apostles in the neo-charismatic Reformation Prayer Network. Most of these things are of a neo-charismatic variety. They often do not have a connection to any actual denomination.
Meaning they have no accountability.
No oversight. They're completely freelance prophets is the best way to categorize them. The Reformation Prayer Network aims to reverse the curse over America by igniting a holy reformation in every sphere of society. And Lance Wallnau is also the one who claimed that former President Donald Trump was anointed by God to restore the crumbling walls that separate us from, what, church-state interference? No, cultural collapse. Cultural collapse. There were walls that separated us from collapse, and the walls that separate us are collapsing, which means now the culture will collapse since the retaining wall of culture is collapsing. I'm having a hard time following the metaphor, but there it is. You might also notice, who's the author? Catherine Stewart. Hi, Catherine. We're talking about you today on the Holy Post. You might also notice, oops, I turned too far, many warnings about demons and spiritual battle on the campaign trail. Herschel Walker alerted us that the nation is entangled in spiritual battle, and he offered himself as a warrior for God. On Eric Metaxas' radio show, Sky, do you know who Eric Metaxas is?
I've heard of him.
Yeah, where he interviews conservative politicians and cultural figures, repeat guest Roger Stone told Metaxas that a demonic portal had opened above the White House that you could see with the naked eye, he claimed. Mike Flynn's Reawaken America tour, Pentecostal pastor Mark Burns called out to the cheering crowd, "I've come here to declare war on every demonic, demon-possessed Democrat that comes from the gates of hell."
So just some of them.
Just everyone.
Just those demon-possessed ones?
Every Democrat that's actually a demon from hell. Not actually a human being. Just let that sink in. This idea that the American political realm is a place of spiritual warfare in a literal, not metaphorical sense, is one of the defining elements of the new forms of highly politicized religion that are surging across the country. And I wrote a note in the article right there to question if it's a highly politicized religion or if it is a highly religiousized politics that we're actually witnessing, because it's more driven by politics than it is by any known tenets of any known faith.
I think it's driven more by money.
You think Herschel Walker wanted to be a senator and fight for God because of money?
I'm not. I think you can't look at any one particular person in this, but when you look at the general trend, especially the YouTube profit thing, there's so many of them because there's now this platform on which you can make a ton of money attracting viewers with this ridiculous nonsense. And so it's proliferated as a result. There's no accountability. There's money to be made. They use fear, anger, and outrage and all this crazy demonic culture warring stuff in politics because it's the right recipe to attract a large audience to make a lot of money. And when you see one guy successful at it, it's going to attract more people onto the platforms and it proliferates. So I mean, I don't want to.
You can't be. Okay, Sky. I'm going to call you out on that.
Call me out, Phil.
I'm going to call you out on that, Sky. It's hard to be that passionate about things that are that tenuous and say it's just about money, unless they're all just incredible actors. But I think they believe this, Sky. I think they believe it.
I am sure some of them do. No doubt some of them do. But I think a good chunk of them are total charlatans.
Okay. Well, we got the New Apostolic Reformation, which is characterized by its role in popularizing a vision of modern-day apostles and prophets, spiritual warfare with demons and territorial spirits, and the ideology of Seven Mountains Dominionism, which says conservative Christians are to take control of the seven key features, often referred to as mountains, because hill just seemed a little wimpy, or molders of culture, including government, business, media, education, entertainment, family, and religion. I've always wondered how a religion can take the mountain of religion or take the mountain of family.
Beat other religions.
To the family? To get to the family? First? Okay.
Yeah.
But some of the same patterns of thought and expression popular among Christian apostolic and prophetic movements are gaining traction among those who identify with other religious movements and denominations. For example, Michael Flynn, who's one of the leaders of the Revive, Revoice America, whatever his tour is Catholic. Ron DeSantis is another one who's kind of jumping in on spiritual warfare Christianity, who said at a recent event, "Put on the full armor of God and stand firm against the left's schemes," he said, substituting the left for the biblical phrasing, the devil. So tell me, do you think that's religion becoming political, or do you think that's politics becoming religious? Because I think it's the latter.
I do think one of the things I appreciated about Catherine Stewart's handling of this was getting into some of the history of Pentecostalism and the way that theology could be appropriated. But what's also interesting to me is it's on one hand, there is this theology that takes on a political fervor, and Pentecostalism has its own history of doing that. And I wish actually that we had more interaction with a lot of the African-American roots of Pentecostalism that have a very different kind of interaction with this. But it's interesting to me that there's all of these Pentecostal roots of some of this Trumpy stuff, but then a lot of the people that I knew that were very fervent that this was a Christian movement for Trump were cessationists. The opposite of Pentecostal. So there is, I think, to your point, Phil, like what ends up bringing people together in this is the politics more than the theology, because you're willing to work across a divide that when I grew up, people who were Pentecostal, I mean, that was those were the bad guys. Like those people who don't understand that God doesn't work that way anymore, that was a real theological divide. And the fact that I watched people who I thought that really mattered to them kind of chuck that in favor of Paula White invoking angels from Africa to come make sure that Trump won the election, I think shows that politics is driving the train more than the theology. The theology plays a significant role, and I appreciate Catherine Stewart saying this is serious and I should learn more about Pentecostalism than the average American journalist actually knows about it. But I think
there's so I just wonder how much of this was affected by Frank Peretti's This Present Darkness and Lindsay's The Late Great Planet Earth and then the Left Behind novels that were so. Because we're going to talk more about premillennial dispensationalism, because I just read a giant book about it, and I can't wait to talk about it all at great length. But one of the things that happened in the history of premillennial dispensationalism that the author of this book that I read, Hummel, would point to about the year 2000 is that this belief in an imminent rapture, in an epic battle, in a tribulation coming for the church from liberal, from the world order, from the one world government. All of that became completely detached from actual premillennial dispensationalism theology.
Yeah.
And so it was, starting with Moody and then moving on all the way to Lindsay in the 70s, there was a cherry picking of dispensational theology of the most exciting elements, which were almost all eschatologically focused and had nothing to do with how to read the Old Testament, or the way to look at the rest of the Bible. And those elements got served up by Lindsay's book in 1971, which became the best-selling nonfiction book of the entire 1970s and had so much more influence than anyone remembers now. And now, ever since then, politicians started picking up threads of that. I think it's those guys. I think that guy is probably the Antichrist, and those guys are promoting the one world government. And this is our last chance to resist, what's coming. And it became completely detached from actual theology and more of a folk religion. So I think what you see now in some of these circles is folk religion with elements of premillennial dispensationalism that are carried along by people that have no connection to any religious institution anywhere whatsoever. And they're really just selling folk religion, with a populist message.
That has existed in every culture throughout history. It just happens to take on the veneer of Christianity in the United States. And if this were happening in India, it would take on the veneer of Hinduism. If it were happening in Saudi Arabia, it would be Islam. And what's really sad about it, and I wish she had gotten into this a little bit more in the article, despite its roots in Pentecostal theology, what we're seeing is the antithesis of Pentecostal theology. And what I mean by that is two things. First of all, the great gift of the Pentecostal tradition is an awareness that the Holy Spirit comes and fills all believers. And that means that with access to the Holy Spirit directly, we have direct access to communion with God and the discernment that comes from that. But what we see from these YouTube preachers or these YouTube prophets or the gig prophets, whatever they're being called, is essentially them saying, you can't really know what's going on in the world without me. I am going to be your guru. I am the only one who could really talk to God. And it's the antithesis of the flattening that Pentecostalism is supposed to do. And here's the second biggie. Rather than emphasizing the way we're told in Scripture that we know someone possesses the Spirit of God is through the fruit that they bear. Jesus talks about this in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7. Paul talks about this in Galatians 5. If someone is exhibiting love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control, that's evidence that the Spirit of Christ is within them. But what you get from this false Pentecostalism from these YouTube preachers is the way you know I have the Spirit of God is through the spectacular things I can do, or the spectacular predictions I can make. It's all the spectacular stuff. And Paul directly dismantles that argument in 1 Corinthians 13 when he says, if I can speak in the tongues of men and angels, but I have not faith, I'm nothing, or have not love, I'm nothing. And he gets, he whittles away at all these spectacular gifts to say at the end of the day, it's about love. And what you see from these people is not love, it's anger, it's outrage, it's hatred. And for people to get duped into this, thinking this is real spirit-driven Christianity, is sick and saddening at the same time. It is none of it. This is not Christianity. This is a false gospel, and it's the complete opposite of what we're called to.
So the other element in this that's interesting is that it's not just an American thing now. It's what we saw happen in Brazil, which was a heavily Pentecostal movement that supported Bolsonaro and then rose up and attacked the Capitol, claiming, obviously that demons had infected the voting machines and stolen the election from him. And what's interesting is that Bolsonaro encouraged the conversation of spiritual warfare and my enemies are demonic. And he's not Pentecostal, he's Catholic. So, it's...
There's a Pentecostal stream in the Catholic Church too.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Probably, especially in South America.
Yeah.
She says this style of religion appears to fit most easily with political ideologies centered on religious authoritarianism. That too many people have too much of a say, and they're doing the devil's work. Mm-hmm. And if the other side is doing the devil's work, we need to lessen their impact, whatever that takes. And that's where people look at the anti-democratic tendencies, which you see in Christian nationalism, even in the U.S. And it's a little concerning. Caitlin, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, no, I want to say the thing that they're right about, which is that there are spiritual dimensions to the things happening in our world. And I think to Skye's point, we are more interested in spectacular versions of that say there are demons infiltrating the voting booths than we are in saying, actually, there are powers and principalities at work. And in a lot of modern Western democracies, they are not going to operate in those kind of spectacular ways. That wouldn't be very effective to us. We've been so taught to think about the world as just entirely natural, and there is no supernatural element, that they work with that. So to Skye's point about money, I think people do a lot for money that seems completely irrational to us because mammon is a spiritual power at work in our society in a degree that it isn't in other places where there might be other kinds of spiritual dimensions, or the powers and principalities might take other forms. I mean, I remember in seminary, people reading this book about demons in Brazil for this class, and everyone was so excited about wow, spiritual warfare and these kind of explicit ways. And I don't think that book was lying. I think there are parts of the world where that is how the powers and principalities are working. But what was so frustrating was that people in America read that and thought, well, I'm glad we don't have those problems here. We don't have demons running around doing stuff. We don't have, and it's not realizing that the powers of racism and consumerism and all of those things that we think are just totally natural, mechanistic things in the world, we're enacting a lot of spiritual power and control over them. And because we were looking for demons hiding in voting boxes, we missed the fact that racism and capitalism and all of those other kinds of ways that order us towards material goods as opposed to valuing human beings, those were hiding in our voting booths too. They were just hiding in us because they had been forming our hearts and our desires, and they were shaping how we voted, not because demons were in voting boxes changing the votes themselves.
It brings up a point I've made frequently in other places, but apart from scripture, I think all truth comes from the Godfather movies. And one of the great lines, and I think it's Godfather Part 2, is you keep your friends close, you keep your enemies even closer. And I think the enemy has kept the church so close that we don't even recognize him as the enemy anymore. And if you think the enemy is some big, bad, obvious, terrible thing outside the church, you've been completely duped. It's usually the stuff that you're closest to that you can't even recognize as a problem. And that's your point, Caitlin, is it's not demons in Africa or Brazil or whatever. It's the stuff that we think is good and righteous and true that is probably what's leading us astray. Those are the things that are going to win our affections of our hearts away from God. And we need to be looking at that speck in our own eye and self-aware and reflective on what am I being drawn to that is bad and unhelpful, even though I think it's good. And we've got it so backwards, and there are so many people making so much money off of people's lack of discernment and wisdom. Yeah. And in one regard, I don't feel bad for them, but the judgment that is coming for them one day will be incredibly horrible because of the way they've used the name of Jesus and what people think is truth to deceive them.
Yeah. She ends the piece in the New Republic by saying, many people blame America's current political dysfunction on former President Donald Trump, and they take for granted that the problem will go away when he at long last departs. It is true that Trump has been exceptionally successful in weaponizing spiritual warfare Christianity and has pushed it further along, but the truth is he was more of a creation of it than the other way around. It preceded him and will long outlast him. And talks about Ron DeSantis trying to take on, some of that same mantle of I'm the savior of those that see the world in a great spiritual war against leftists.
Well, this is what fueled January 6th. It's what fueled the rebellion in Brazil. It's, that horrible story of the guy who beat Paul Pelosi with a hammer in his home. Like, eventually, spiritual warfare becomes physical warfare. And if people really believe that Democrats in this case are demons from the pit of hell, as one of these guys said, or Ron DeSantis saying that the schemes of the left rather than the schemes of the devil, misquoting scripture, people end up believing that. They're going to take that warfare mindset out of just praying on their knees, and they're going to go with weapons and harm other people. And nothing could be further from the message of Jesus.
Well, and it doesn't help that, in Stephen Wolfe's book, A Case for Christian Nationalism, which is the current best-selling book on the topic of Christian nationalism and is an argument for it, advocates at the end of the book that it may be justifiable to use violence at this point, that we are living under tyranny and that a political uprising may be justified. So when you have lots of people at home reading a book, that's painting the situation in stark terms like that. Last week there was an effort from another proponent of Christian nationalism to kind of separate it from the Stephen Wolfe more extreme form. Basically says Stephen Wolfe, what he wants to do is like if you were starting a nation from scratch, this is how you would set it up, and other religions would be illegal, and it would be about one ethnic group and one piece of land, which a lot of people who've reviewed his book say, well, you've really described blood and soil Nazism pretty well there, and then you say this is what Jesus wants. That's a little, I don't know. Anyway, so another effort is to say what the rest of us are going for is that that's a good experiment. That's a good project, what he's doing. But what the rest of us are doing is something slightly different where and this is how one of them described it, we're concerned with recovering America's Christian political heritage. That's a different project. We want to work within the Constitution to make America Christian again. And so we should call that something different. So he's proposing that we call that Christian federalism. And Christian nationalism is when you start a new nation from scratch and make it about one kin, one land, one religion.
Why can't we just talk about Christian discipleship?
Why
can't we just talk about, can we make people who are already saying they're committed to Jesus actually follow the teachings of Jesus? That to me sounds like the place to begin, not either the Constitution or blood and soil Christianity. Like, I don't know, maybe I'm crazy.
Sky, that's not very exciting. We want something that feels more like a video game. And if there's demons coming out of the Democratic Party, and if I need to take up the sword of the Spirit and, use the full armor of God in a literal sense, that is exciting. I like it. I feel like Frodo. You can carry me up the mountain because I can hold the Ring of Power and drop it in Mordor. Have you watched that yet, Caitlin? Have you watched Lord of the Rings?
I watched the first one.
Okay, that's good. Well, you don't get any of that stuff. It's
Add
so
Back
much
to the
more
Future
exciting.
to the list.
We want things to be more exciting because we live in a world that's mostly now in a state of maintenance, not conquest. And a lot of young men miss. It was like, I missed the opportunity to conquest. I missed it. Give me something to conquer. And this is where we are.
Not to sound too much like Jordan Peterson, but good grief, just make your bed in the morning. Like, conquer that. Just get your life together and get to your job on time. That's a conquest.
Oh, no,
But
I'm not.
Balance your checkbook.
That's the impulse the whole time, right? That's the sons of Zebedee saying, like, yeah, let's do it. Take the power on. And Jesus saying, like, no, the way before us is not like the rulers that you have seen and the rulers that you have seen lord power over you. And instead, the least among you will be the greatest. Like, that's the temptation the entire time is always going to be, I want to conquer something. And Jesus saying, slow down. No.
Yeah, or Aaron's sons saying, yay, we're priests. Let's run into the tabernacle and get God power. And then they drop dead. Slow down, guys.
A warning.
It's Peter grabbing the sword and going on the attack, trying to protect Jesus from the soldiers, and Jesus turning and saying, those who live by the sword will die by the sword. This is not how it's supposed to be for you. But that's always the temptation of the church, is to try to accomplish the way, the kingdom of God with the world's means. And it's not what we're called to.
And that's the irony of, this is the last thing I promise. This is the irony of the pre-mill kind of, we have to fight the powers and principalities because Jesus is coming back. And that message, as Skye is giving other examples, I'm thinking, well, where is the conquering and the violence? In Revelation, there is the conquering and the violence. And that is supposed to be not only comfort to oppressed peoples, which we don't understand, but also supposed to be a message to people to say, you should have this vision of Jesus returning and you should be awaiting that. And that should fuel your life now. And yet, that kind of judgment is not in your hands. That is in the Lord's hands. And knowing that that judgment is coming against the people who harm you should give you the courage to not exact revenge against them now, to know that that judgment is not in your hands, it is God's. And so do what you can, seek justice in the ways you can, but not everything is justified, violence especially, because it's not up to you to enact it. God has promised that it will come, and an act of hope and courage in the face of violence now and of injustice now is to work for it within limits, but then to trust that God will come and make everything right eventually.
But don't you think Jesus would appreciate it if we got a little bit of a head start for him? So he didn't have so much to do. So much.
Yeah, like, can't we just take the drag queens out for him? Right?
Yeah.
Isn't that enough?
Can we just pick one category of sinner, of evildoer, and take him out just for practice?
No.
Because I don't even know if I can hold a sword in my mouth when he comes back.
No.
I've never even tried that. Okay. Hey, everybody. Jason Rugg was our editor for the last 7 years. He has moved on to other things. So we want to thank Jason for everything he did, how he contributed for all those years. And also, if you want to follow what he's doing, he's attempting to put together a animated movie project with his buddy Sean, who was the unnamed intern for about half of those years on the podcast. You could go to oneworldmovie.com. And you can get updates there on what Jason is up to now. And he would love to be able to keep you posted on what he's doing. So thanks, Jason, for everything you did. Thanks, Caitlin, for being here. Thanks, Skye, for being here. Thanks, Patreon supporters, for supporting us so we can pay the bills and actually have people to help us. It's been fantastic. We're enjoying it very much. We'll have an interview later this week. Come back for it. It's going to be great. And we'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Holy Post Media. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele, and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much more.